The morning light filtered through ancient oak branches as I followed the familiar path toward my creek. Birds called to one another overhead, their songs mixing with the gentle babble of running water. This land had belonged to my family for 4 generations, passed down with the understanding that we were not just owners but caretakers. The property stretched for nearly 30 acres, but the jewel was always the creek that cut through the eastern border. I still remembered the day 3 years ago when the Department of Environmental Protection contacted me. Their ecological survey had discovered something remarkable. My humble creek was home to 3 endangered species of salamander that bred nowhere else in the state. The official had explained the significance with reverence in his voice. "This ecosystem is irreplaceable, sir. The combination of water chemistry, plant life, and undisturbed habitat has created something truly special." Within months, my creek received official designation as a protected breeding zone. I took the responsibility seriously. Each morning I walked the creek banks, monitoring water levels and checking for any issues. I kept detailed logs of wildlife sightings, photographing the delicate salamanders when they appeared during breeding season. I learned to identify invasive plants that might threaten the native species and remove them carefully by hand. The preservationist at the county office joked that my documentation was more thorough than their official records. The first signs of trouble appeared gradually. One morning I noticed trampled vegetation near the eastern bend of the creek. The damage was subtle, flattened reeds and disturbed soil, but to my trained eye, it stood out like a beacon. I assumed local teenagers might have found my swimming hole. Disappointed but not alarmed, I posted additional protected wildlife habitat signs along the property line. The next week, I found something more disturbing. Candy wrappers and a plastic water bottle tangled in the very reeds where great blue herons nested each spring. My concern deepened when I discovered cigarette butts pressed into the mud near a critical breeding pool. This was no longer innocent trespassing. This was dangerous to the fragile ecosystem I was entrusted to protect. I installed a simple trail camera near the most frequently disturbed area, hopping to identify the trespassers. For 2 weeks, the camera captured nothing unusual, just natural wildlife movements and the occasional passing deer. I began to wonder if perhaps the incidents had stopped, if my additional signage had deterred whoever was entering my property. Then came the morning that changed everything. I followed my usual path along the creek, listening to spring peepers announcing the start of breeding season. As I rounded the bend past the large sycamore tree, I stopped in my tracks. My blood ran cold at the sight before me. There, on the most sensitive part of the creek bank, the primary breeding ground for the endangered salamanders, stood a full campsite. A large green tent had been erected directly on the fragile soil. Folding chairs circled a portable fire pit that sat atop rare native plants. A Coleman stove and portable table were positioned at the water edge. Coolers and camping equipment lay scattered across the bank, crushing everything beneath them. Soap suds from what must have been morning dishes floated in the crystal-clear water. My sanctuary had been violated. 3 years of careful preservation work potentially undone in a single night. The protective anger that rose within me was unlike anything I had felt before. My paradise had been disturbed, and everything was about to change. I pulled my phone from my pocket and began documenting the damage. The camera clicked as I captured images of trampled vegetation, the tent stakes driven directly into protected soil, and soap residue forming an oily film on the water surface. These photographs would serve as evidence, though for what purpose I did not yet know. My immediate concern was stopping further damage before it became irreversible. As I approached the campsite, movement caught my eye. The tent flap opened, and a woman emerged stretching her arms overhead as if she owned the place. She appeared to be in her mid-40s, with highlighted blonde hair pulled into a ponytail and expensive outdoor clothing that looked barely worn. Behind her came two children, perhaps 10 and 12 years old, followed by a man I presumed to be her husband, carrying a coffee mug. The family gathered around their portable table, the woman directing the others to set out breakfast items. They moved with casual confidence, completely oblivious to or unconcerned with the environmental damage they were causing with each step. None of them noticed me until I cleared my throat. The woman turned first, her expression shifting from surprise to something defensive before I even spoke a word. Her posture stiffened, chin lifting slightly. I recognized the look. She was preparing for confrontation before one had even begun. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice calm and even. "I am sorry to interrupt your breakfast, but I need to inform you that you are camping on private property. More importantly, this is a protected wildlife breeding zone for endangered species." The woman set down her coffee mug with deliberate slowness. "This is clearly public access land," she responded, her tone dismissive. "We have every right to enjoy nature. We are not hurting anything." I gestured toward the multiple signs posted along the property line, clearly visible from where we stood. Those signs indicate this is private land and a federally protected wildlife habitat. The area where your tent is placed is actually the primary breeding ground for endangered salamanders. "Those signs do not mean anything," she countered, waving her hand dismissively. "I pay taxes in this county. This creek is a natural waterway, which means public access is guaranteed." Her husband shifted uncomfortably, studying his coffee mug with sudden interest. The children glanced between us, sensing the tension building in the air. "That is actually incorrect," I explained, trying to maintain my composure. "While some waterways have public access rights, this creek is entirely on private property and has special federal protection status. I can show you the property survey and federal designation if that would help clarify." Her expression hardened into something unnervingly hostile. "And who exactly are you to make these claims? Do you have proof of ownership with you right now?" "I am the property owner. My family has owned this land for 4 generations. The deed and surveys are at my house, but—" "Convenient," she interrupted. "Anyone can claim to own property. For all we know, you are just some environmental extremist harassing innocent families enjoying nature." Her husband finally spoke, his voice quiet. "Perhaps we should pack up, dear, if this is private property." "Absolutely not, Mark," she snapped without looking at him. "He has not shown any proof. We have rights." She turned back to me, pulling out her smartphone. "In fact, I am going to call the police and report harassment. You are making my children feel unsafe in a public space." The absurdity of her claim left me momentarily speechless. I was the property owner, confronting trespassers who were actively damaging protected habitat, yet somehow she was positioning herself as the victim. "Please do call the authorities," I finally replied. I was about to do the same. They can verify everything I have told you, including my ownership and the protected status of this land. Her eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "No, it is simply a statement of fact. I need to protect this habitat. It is my legal responsibility." She held up her phone like a weapon. "I am calling the police right now to report you for harassment and threatening behavior." I recognized that further direct confrontation would only escalate the situation. The damage to the habitat was already done for now. The priority was ensuring they left and did not return. "I will step away while you pack up your things," I said calmly. I will also be contacting the wildlife authorities about the environmental violations. Please be careful not to cause additional damage as you leave." As I turned to walk away, I heard her speaking into her phone, her voice pitched higher than before, trembling slightly as she described being threatened by an aggressive man while on a family camping trip. Her performance was convincing. If I had not been the supposed aggressor, I might have believed her myself. I retreated toward my property line, my own phone already dialing the Department of Environmental Protection. I would handle this properly, through official channels. Surely the authorities would understand the importance of protecting a federally designated wildlife breeding zone. Hope filled me as the Department of Environmental Protection officer answered my call. I explained the situation in detail, the trespassing, the damage to the protected habitat, the ongoing confrontation. His response was everything I had wished for. "We take these protected zones very seriously, sir," he assured me, his voice carrying the authority I desperately needed. "This is a federal violation, not just trespassing. I will dispatch an officer to your location right away." Encouraged, I also called the local police department to report the trespassers. The dispatcher promised to send someone out to address the situation. With both environmental authorities and local law enforcement on their way, I felt certain the matter would be resolved properly. I waited near my property line, occasionally checking that the family had not expanded their damage to other areas. Nearly 2 hours passed before I heard vehicles approaching. A police cruiser arrived first, followed shortly by a truck bearing the Department of Environmental Protection logo. Relief washed over me as I walked to meet them. Finally, official intervention would put an end to this violation of my property and the protected habitat. My relief was short-lived. The police officer, a young man who looked barely out of training, approached with visible reluctance. The environmental officer, a middle-aged woman in a field uniform, stood at an awkward distance, her clipboard held like a barrier between us. "You reported trespassers on your property?" the police officer asked, his tone suggesting this was a nuisance call rather than a legitimate complaint. "Yes, they have set up camp directly on protected breeding grounds for endangered species," I explained, gesturing toward the creek bank. The woman became confrontational when I asked them to leave. Before either officer could respond, Karen, as I would later learn was her name, approached with tears glistening in her eyes. Her children stood slightly behind her, looking appropriately solemn. Her husband trailed behind, his discomfort even more apparent. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," she said, her voice wavering. "We were just having a peaceful family camping trip when this man began harassing us, telling us we had to leave immediately." The transformation was remarkable. The confrontational woman from earlier had vanished, replaced by this picture of maternal concern and innocent victimhood. "We were just leaving today anyway," she added, though their equipment suggested a longer planned stay. "We come to this spot every spring. It has always been open to the public." The police officer turned to me with a questioning look. I opened my property survey app on my phone, showing him the clearly marked boundaries. This entire area is private property, and more importantly, it is a federally protected wildlife breeding zone. I have documentation. The environmental officer finally stepped forward, but her demeanor did not provide the confidence I had expected. "We are severely understaffed due to recent budget cuts," she explained quietly. "While we can issue warnings about disturbing protected habitats, actual enforcement requires documentation of direct harm to protected species." "There are soap suds in the water," I pointed out. They have a fire pit directly on breeding ground soil. The chemical composition changes are absolutely harmful to the salamander eggs. The police officer sighed. Look, this seems like a situation you folks should try to work out like neighbors. The family says they are leaving today anyway. They are not neighbors, I corrected. They are trespassers causing damage to federally protected land. Karen wiped at her eyes. We had no idea this was private property. There should be clearer signs. We are nature lovers ourselves. We would never intentionally harm wildlife. I pointed to the multiple clearly visible signs posted along the property line. The signs are posted every 50 feet. The environmental officer made notes on her clipboard but offered little else. We can document your complaint and issue a warning. If you observe them returning, please call again. So they face no consequences for trespassing and damaging protected habitat? I asked, disbelief creeping into my voice. We will check back in the area over the next few days, the police officer offered, already turning toward his vehicle. As the authorities departed with nothing but vague promises to monitor the situation, Karen gathered her family to continue packing up their campsite. As she passed me, she flashed a smug, knowing smile. Gone was any pretense of innocent confusion or tears. The system designed to protect this land and its inhabitants had utterly failed. The realization settled over me like a physical weight. If official channels would not enforce protection of this critical habitat, the responsibility would fall entirely to me. The failure of authorities to take meaningful action left me deeply unsettled. That evening, I spread property documents across my dining room table, deed papers, surveys, tax records, and most importantly, the Federal Wildlife Protection designation. Everything confirmed what I already knew. The creek and surrounding land were both legally mine and environmentally protected. The question was how to enforce those protections when official channels had proven ineffective. I began researching wildlife protection laws, discovering that penalties for disturbing federally protected breeding grounds could reach tens of thousands of dollars per violation. The law was clear and strong. The enforcement was the weak link. If I wanted action, I would need irrefutable evidence that even reluctant officials could not ignore. The next morning, I purchased 6 high-quality trail cameras with night vision capabilities and extended battery life. I positioned them strategically along the creek bank, focusing on the areas that had been damaged and seemed most vulnerable to future intrusions. Each camera was carefully concealed within the natural environment, their lenses trained on the protected areas while remaining invisible to casual observation. For 2 weeks, the cameras captured only wildlife, deer coming to drink at dawn, raccoons washing food at the water edge, and most encouragingly, the endangered salamanders returning to their breeding pools despite the recent disturbance. I began to hope that perhaps Karen and her family had indeed moved on, that the warning, insufficient as it was, had accomplished something. That hope shattered on the 3rd Saturday after our confrontation. The motion-activated cameras sent alerts to my phone throughout the morning. Karen had returned, not just with her immediate family, but with 2 other couples as well. They set up an expanded camp in the exact same location, this time with multiple tents, a larger cooking area, and even portable lawn chairs placed directly in the shallow water at the creek edge. I watched the footage with growing dismay as they trampled across restoration areas I had carefully replanted. One man dumped cooking grease directly into the water, while another tossed beer cans toward a makeshift garbage pile that was already spilling into the creek. Karen directed it all, gesturing expansively as if conducting a tour of her personal paradise. "This is our special spot," I heard her tell the group as the camera captured audio. It is perfect for weekend getaways without the crowds of public parks. The trail cameras continued capturing evidence over the following weeks. Karen returned not just once but multiple times, each visit bringing different guests. Sometimes couples, sometimes groups of women who appeared to be friends. The pattern became clear: she was using my protected creek as her personal recreation spot for social gatherings, complete with wine glasses, portable speaker systems, and total disregard for the environmental damage. Social media searches revealed her identity: Karen Westfield, a prominent realtor with the largest agency in the county. Her business website featured an entire section on community leadership and environmental stewardship. One photo showed her receiving an award from the Chamber of Commerce for organizing a one-day river cleanup event. The hypocrisy was staggering, publicly positioning herself as an environmental advocate while privately destroying protected habitat for personal entertainment. More concerning were the photos showing her at fundraisers with several county council members and the mayor. Her Facebook page featured images of her presenting donation checks to the campaigns of 2 commissioners currently serving on the county board. Her political connections likely explained the reluctance of local authorities to enforce trespassing laws against her. I needed expert validation of the environmental damage. I contacted Dr. James Merritt, an environmental scientist specializing in aquatic ecosystems at the State University. After explaining the situation, he agreed to conduct an independent assessment of the creek habitat. Dr. Merritt spent a full day examining the creek bank, collecting water and soil samples, and documenting conditions with scientific precision. His findings confirmed my worst fears. These detergents from their dishwashing are toxic to amphibian eggs, he explained, pointing to foam accumulating in breeding pools. The surfactants disrupt the permeable membrane of the eggs, causing developmental abnormalities or death. He gestured to the fire pit areas. And these ash deposits significantly change soil chemistry critical for native plants. The pH alteration alone could prevent germination of several endangered plant species I have identified here. His official report documented precisely how the recreational activities threatened multiple protected species. The chemical analysis of water samples showed elevated levels of phosphates from soap, petroleum residue from portable generators, and alcohol from spilled drinks, all known toxins to sensitive amphibian species. This is not casual impact, Dr. Merritt concluded. This is systematic degradation of a protected ecosystem. If it continues at the current rate, you could see complete breeding failure this season. Armed with time-stamped video evidence, expert scientific analysis, and documentation of repeated violations, I was building a comprehensive case that no one, not even politically connected trespassers, could dismiss as neighborly disagreement. This was about law, science, and accountability, and I was just getting started. The scope of the problem had grown beyond what I could address alone. Karen was not just a one-time trespasser, but a repeat offender with political connections who viewed my protected creek as her personal playground. To combat this effectively, I needed allies who shared my concern for environmental protection and could bring additional resources to bear. My first call was to the Watershed Alliance, a regional nonprofit dedicated to protecting water resources throughout the county. Their director, Elena Vasquez, agreed to meet me at a local coffee shop the following afternoon. I arrived with my laptop loaded with trail camera footage and Dr. Merritt's scientific analysis. Elena studied the evidence with growing concern, occasionally taking notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "This is troubling on multiple levels," she said finally. Your creek is not an isolated ecosystem. It feeds directly into Henderson Lake, which supplies drinking water to 3 communities downstream. She opened a satellite map on her tablet, tracing the water flow with her finger. Contamination here affects everyone downstream. The chemicals they are introducing, soaps, sunscreen, insect repellent, all eventually make their way into the municipal water supply. As we discussed potential approaches, another customer approached our table. The woman introduced herself as Patricia Landers, explaining that she had overheard portions of our conversation. "I could not help but notice you mentioned Karen Westfield," Patricia said quietly. "If you are talking about the realtor with the blonde highlights who treats nature like her personal spa, I have been dealing with the same problem on my property." Patricia described how Karen had been bringing groups to her private pond for wellness retreats until she installed security cameras and confronted her. She simply moved her operation elsewhere. I suspect that elsewhere is your creek. By the end of that week, 2 more property owners had contacted me with eerily similar stories. Karen had apparently been discovering private natural areas throughout the county and claiming them for her social gatherings. When confronted or forced out of one location, she simply found another to exploit. My creek was just the latest in her series of appropriated natural settings. Through Alina's connections, I arranged a meeting with retired environmental lawyer Simon Greenfield. His credentials were impeccable, 30 years litigating environmental protection cases at both state and federal levels before his retirement 3 years ago. I expected a brief consultation, but the evidence captured his full attention. "This is not just trespassing," he said, reviewing the footage of Karen directing guests to set up equipment directly on sensitive habitat. "This is knowing and willful damage to protected habitat. The fact that she returned multiple times after being informed of the protected status elevates this considerably." Simon offered his expertise without charge, his passion for environmental protection clearly reignited by the case. Environmental laws are powerful but often under-enforced due to budget constraints and political pressure. What we need is a coalition approach that brings pressure from multiple angles simultaneously. The local newspaper reporter, Anita Washington, joined our growing alliance after Alina reached out to her contacts in the media. Anita listened carefully as we presented the evidence, asking pointed questions about enforcement failures and political connections. "We need to show this is not just one landowner against one trespasser," she explained. "This represents systematic failures in environmental protection. That is the larger story that will capture public attention and potentially drive policy changes." Our small group had expanded to 8 dedicated individuals when the most unexpected ally arrived. Robert Two Eagles, a representative from the Indigenous Tribal Council, contacted me directly after hearing about our efforts through conservation networks. We met at the creek itself, where Robert walked the banks silently, observing the damaged areas and the remaining pristine sections with equal attention. Finally, he unfolded a set of maps and legal documents that added an entirely new dimension to our efforts. "Your creek is part of spawning grounds protected by treaties that predate current property lines," he explained. "These waters have been recognized in federal treaties as essential to native fish populations that our people have stewarded for generations." The tribal government had separate federal standing to protect these waters under treaty obligations that created additional legal avenues for enforcement. "We have jurisdiction that operates parallel to conventional environmental law," Robert explained. And our Tribal Environmental Protection Office has enforcement capabilities through the Department of Interior that bypass local political interference. Our coalition gathered for a strategy session in my living room, the space barely accommodating the diverse group of stakeholders now invested in protecting the creek. What had begun as my isolated problem had transformed into a community cause with multiple legal avenues and growing public support. Simon outlined our multi-layered approach. We will simultaneously pursue trespassing charges, environmental protection violations, treaty rights enforcement, and public awareness through media coverage. If the local authorities will not act due to political connections, we bypass them and go directly to federal environmental agencies and tribal jurisdiction. Elena pointed to watershed protection statutes that created additional liability. The reporter developed a series of articles exploring environmental protection failures throughout the region. Robert coordinated with tribal environmental officers who had separate authority to inspect and protect waterways under treaty agreements. By the evening's end, we had developed a comprehensive strategy that approached the problem from every possible legal and community angle. But the most powerful component emerged when Simon suggested the formation of a coordinated monitoring and response team. "We need to catch them in the act," he explained, with representatives from every relevant agency present simultaneously. No more excuses, no more passing the buck between jurisdictions. What Karen did not realize was that her next exclusive Creek Spa retreat would have a very different outcome from what she planned. The stage was set for what Simon called the perfect trap. Our coalition monitored the trail cameras diligently over the next 2 weeks, establishing patterns in Karen's creek visits. She typically brought guests on Saturday mornings, arriving around 9 and departing mid-afternoon. The environmental damage was cumulative, each visit degrading the habitat further as breeding season progressed for the endangered salamanders. "We need to time our intervention perfectly," Simon advised during our planning session. "The greatest impact will come from catching them in the midst of multiple violations, with all relevant authorities present simultaneously." According to Dr. Merritt's assessment, the coming weekend marked the peak of salamander breeding season. The delicate eggs would be at their most vulnerable stage, making any chemical contamination particularly devastating. The weather forecast predicted perfect spring conditions, exactly when both wildlife activity and Karen's visits were most frequent. Our coalition prepared meticulously. Simon drafted cease and desist letters for each adult who might be present. Robert secured commitments from federal tribal enforcement officers who had jurisdiction under treaty provisions. Elena coordinated with state environmental officials who had been reluctant to act previously, but now faced pressure from multiple conservation organizations. Anita ensured her editor had reserved space for the story, regardless of which day the intervention occurred. I checked and rechecked the batteries in every trail camera, repositioning several to capture better angles of the most sensitive habitat areas. We installed additional discrete monitoring equipment to measure water quality in real time, creating a scientific record of any contamination as it occurred. The trap was set. Each coalition member had specific responsibilities and remained on standby, ready to converge when signaled. We established a text message alert system that would notify everyone simultaneously once Karen and her guests were fully settled into their illegal activities. Saturday morning arrived with golden spring light filtering through new foliage. Birds called enthusiastically from the trees surrounding the creek, their songs a reminder of what we were fighting to protect. I positioned myself at an observation point on higher ground, binoculars and phone ready. The wait was tense but not long. At 8:47 a.m., the first luxury SUV appeared on the county road bordering my property. Through my binoculars, I watched as Karen stepped out, dressed in expensive outdoor wear that appeared designed more for fashion photography than actual outdoor activity. She surveyed the area briefly before waving to the vehicles behind her. 3 more SUVs pulled alongside hers. Women emerged carrying tote bags, coolers, portable furniture, and what appeared to be spa equipment. I counted 12 women in total, all dressed similarly in designer outdoor clothing that likely cost more than most people spend on their entire wardrobe. Karen led them confidently down the trail toward the creek, pointing out features as if conducting a tour of her own property. From my hidden observation point, I documented everything: their arrival, the equipment they carried, and most importantly, their deliberate ignoring of the multiple protected wildlife habitat and no trespassing signs they passed. The group reached the creek bank and immediately began setting up an elaborate arrangement. Portable chairs were placed directly in sensitive habitat. A folding table was erected for food and drinks, its legs crushing native plants that had just begun to recover from previous damage. 2 women carried what appeared to be foot-soaking tubs down to the water edge, positioning them directly adjacent to salamander breeding pools. Karen directed the operation with practiced efficiency, pointing out where to place equipment for the best experience. The women uncorked champagne bottles and set up an elaborate brunch display across the creek bank, complete with glass flutes and porcelain plates, no consideration for the environmental impact of potential breakage. Most concerning was the introduction of scented oils, bath products, and what appeared to be exfoliating scrubs that would inevitably enter the water system. One woman poured an entire bottle of bubble bath directly into a soaking tub that overflowed into the creek itself. For nearly 30 minutes, I documented their escalating violations. When Karen stood to address her guests, raising a champagne flute, I could hear her clearly through the monitoring equipment. "Ladies, welcome to my secret paradise getaway," she announced proudly. "Far from prying eyes and annoying crowds, this exclusive creek spa retreat is the perfect escape from our hectic lives. No reservations needed, no permits required, just pure natural luxury." That was the moment. Her words explicitly confirmed that she knew she had no permission or permits for this activity. I pressed send on the prearranged signal message to our coalition members. "Operation in progress. All units respond. Maximum violations currently occurring." Now came the waiting. 15 excruciating minutes for all authorities to converge simultaneously. I continued documenting as the women spread out across the protected habitat, some wading into the creek itself with wine glasses in hand, others applying facial masks while lounging on portable chairs positioned directly on fragile plant colonies. Karen appeared completely relaxed, utterly confident in her appropriation of this protected space. She had no idea that representatives from 5 different regulatory and enforcement agencies were currently parking their vehicles along the property boundary. She could not see the tribal enforcement officers approaching silently from the western forest edge. She remained oblivious to the reporter and photographer documenting everything from the opposite bank. Years of environmental law enforcement were about to descend on Karen's exclusive creek spa retreat. The perfect trap was sprung, and there would be no escaping accountability this time. As Simon had noted during our planning, the beauty of environmental law is that each separate violation carries its own penalties, and they multiply quickly when multiple jurisdictions are involved. Karen was about to learn a very expensive lesson about respecting protected wildlife habitat, a lesson that would reverberate throughout the county for years to come. The look on Karen's face transformed from relaxed enjoyment to confusion, and then to unmistakable alarm as the first official vehicles became visible through the trees. Her champagne glass froze halfway to her lips as trucks bearing logos from the Department of Environmental Protection, Fish and Wildlife Service, County Sheriff's Office, Tribal Environmental Authority, and State Conservation Office parked in a semicircle along the property boundary. "Ladies, something is wrong," she announced, her voice no longer carrying the confident tone from moments earlier. "Pack up quickly." But it was too late for a hasty retreat. Representatives from each agency approached methodically, clipboards and cameras in hand. Their coordinated arrival left no gap for Karen to employ the same emotional manipulation tactics that had worked with isolated officers previously. "Good morning," Simon said, stepping forward with his legal credentials visible. "I represent the property owner in conjunction with multiple environmental protection agencies. Everyone present is currently trespassing on private property and violating federal wildlife protection statutes." Karen immediately shifted into the victim role that had served her previously. "We had no idea this was private property. There are no clear signs posted." The tribal officer, walking directly past 3 separate no trespassing signs to reach her, spoke with quiet authority. "These waters have been protected by treaty for generations. The signage is abundant and clear." The state environmental officer approached with water testing equipment. "We are detecting elevated chemical levels consistent with contamination from beauty products and alcohol. These are direct violations of the Clean Water Act in a designated critical habitat." One by one, each agency representative presented specific violations under their jurisdiction. The tribal officer documented treaty violations. The wildlife officer photographed damage to endangered species habitat. The sheriff deputy recorded trespassing violations. The conservation officer collected water and soil samples showing contamination. Simon presented the portfolio of evidence we had assembled: photographs showing months of documented incursions, scientific analysis of environmental damage, property surveys, and most damaging, Karen's own social media posts where she had tagged photos with "My Secret Spot" and "Private Creek Retreat." "We have documented 17 separate visits to this protected habitat," Simon explained. "Each constitutes a separate violation under federal environmental protection statutes." Karen's guests quickly distanced themselves from her, some even providing statements about being misled regarding property ownership. "She told us this was her family property," one woman insisted to the officers. "We never would have come if we knew it was protected habitat." The fines accumulated into thousands of dollars as each violation was meticulously cited. $5,000 for habitat disturbance, $10,000 for introducing contaminants to protected waters, $3,500 for trespassing with intent to occupy. The total approached $25,000 before additional penalties for repeat violations were calculated. The reporter took photographs while Karen was issued multiple citations. The story appeared on the front page of Sunday's newspaper. Local realtor faces federal charges for repeated environmental violations. The accompanying editorial called for stronger enforcement of wildlife protection laws throughout the county. 3 months later, I watched from a distance as Karen performed her court-mandated community service. Dressed in an orange vest rather than designer outdoor wear, she planted native species along the creek bank under the supervision of conservation officers. The judge had been particularly creative in his sentencing, 400 hours of environmental restoration work specifically in the habitat she had damaged. The case prompted county officials to increase the environmental protection budget after public outcry over the initial lack of enforcement. 2 new conservation officers were hired specifically to monitor protected wildlife zones throughout the region. My creek bank now bears additional markers designating it an official wildlife sanctuary, with increased penalties for trespassing. The Department of Environmental Protection installed monitoring equipment to provide early alerts about any contamination or disturbance, creating an additional layer of protection. Most rewarding was the Community Restoration Day organized by Alina and the Watershed Alliance. Nearly 50 volunteers gathered to repair habitat damage, removing invasive species that had taken hold in disturbed areas, replanting native vegetation, and restoring the natural contours of the creek bank that had been trampled flat. Among the volunteers were several of Karen's former friends, women who had attended her illegal creek spa retreats, but now understood the importance of respecting protected lands. They worked diligently, asking thoughtful questions about the ecosystem and expressing genuine remorse for their unwitting participation in its damage. As spring arrived again, I witnessed the true victory one misty morning. The first endangered salamanders returned to the restored breeding pools, their delicate forms sliding through crystal-clear water now free of contaminants. Their presence was the greatest vindication of our fight to protect this precious ecosystem, proof that with proper care and protection, even damaged habitats can heal and thrive once again.